Welcome to the Your Data Driven podcast. If you like this podcast, be sure to visit our website at yourdatadriven.com for more useful help and advice on setting up your race car, mastering data analysis, and driving faster. Welcome to episode 24. In this episode, I'm talking to Andrea Quintarelli, a professional engineer working in Ford. Andrea also has a long history and passion for motorsports. Working in his own time with one of my previous guests, Jess Braun, their team at CORE Autosports very nearly beat the Works Outfits LMP2 first time out. Andrea's contribution was his experience in simulation and particularly driver in the loop simulation. We learned how he was working with the race engineer Jeff to use that tool and use that experience to really maximise the best setup for the car in any one event. And this is what you can then take back to your own racing and think about how you can use some objectivity, some maths, and possibly some simulation to also reduce the level of uncertainty for your own race car to give you more success and more fun on track. I really hope you enjoy it. So grab a coffee, sit back and enjoy what Andrea has to say. So, welcome, Andrea.
Thank you very much. Thanks for having me.
It's absolutely lovely to have you here. Thank you so much for taking the time. We've had a couple of false starts on this one, but we've got there in the end, and I'm really excited to hear about you and your background and maybe get one or two takeaways that people listening can apply and think about in terms of their racing, in terms of their track driving, and in terms of maybe being a little bit more methodical or scientific in their approach to racing so they can have more fun and more success. So how does that sound?
Yeah, sounds very interesting.
Wonderful. So tell us a little bit about you, because I think you have a fascinating background. I think some experience in the world of simulation, and which we'll talk about. But also before that, I think you've been involved in motorsports for a little while. So Tell us about you.
Yeah, it's a long-time passion, motorsport. Actually, I was always interested in cars and race cars in particular. I started karting when I was 14. That was my first real contact with motorsport, let me say. And then as I was in the university already, I moved into race engineering a bit. At the beginning on the side of my studies, and then it became a full-time job. I was data engineer and race engineer for some teams until more or less 2011. And then I moved definitely to the automotive industry where I work at right now. I'm located in Germany and I work for Ford of Europe here in Germany. Mainly my experience with road cars at least is on the suspension side. And now the team I'm part of actually moved to a broader topic, let's say more the architecture of the whole car than just suspension. But yeah, the passion for motorsport has always remained, and I always try to find some time beside my everyday job to do the things I like with the people I like as well. So,
whereabouts in Germany are you? Because I did a little bit of time in Ford.
Okay, I always say that in the past before coming here, for me it was always about I'll go where the work brings me and where I can find a good opportunity with this respect. But Cologne was really the first time where I found a city where I would love to live no matter what my job is. It's really a nice place to live. It's a very multicultural city. It's very inclusive. There are a lot of opportunities. It's a big city, but it's not too big. It's a really nice compromise. I really like it.
Yeah, so I spent 6 months living there.
Okay. So
when I was a student years and years ago, and we did the production line for the Focus.
Oh, okay. Yeah, I think as a student you can have a lot of fun in Cologne. I can imagine. I came a bit too late with this respect, but yeah, as a student it must be funny as well.
I think back fondly of Cologne, it should be, isn't it? And the Kolsch and Brauhauses and all this wonderful beer.
Yeah, that's true. I actually don't drink beer. It's really a minus point for me in Germany. But yeah, I enjoy it anyway.
So tell us a bit about, so you're working at Ford and you're doing suspension and maybe more integration now. But where's your connection with racing? Do you still race yourself? Do you drive or anything like that?
No, unfortunately not. Let's say, as I said, I try to keep it at least as an hobby because I understood at a certain point that to bring my career in motorsport forward would have been really demanding in terms of also private life. So I took the very hard decision to move out But since my interest in race cars is still there, I try to always save some time on the side, let me say, to deal with topics that are related to race cars. Unfortunately, I'm not driving, I'm not a sim racer either, but I always try to use also tools like sim racing or anyway simulation to have contact with the, let's say, engineering part of the story. So mainly vehicle dynamics actually, but it's unavoidable that you have to come into contact also with other topics. So unfortunately, no real racer myself, but yeah, very interested and passionate motorsport guy, let me say.
Absolutely. So go on. So tell us a little bit more about your simulation work, because I think you've worked with one of my previous guests, Jeff, and done a bit with him.
Yeah. Let's say at the beginning it started everything as an hobby, as I said. As I moved here to Germany, I started to keep up again with driving simulation first, specifically into physics modeling, so more or less creating vehicle models that you can drive, then driving software simulation. And at a certain point, I felt in love with endurance racing. That was more or less, I would say, 2012, 2013, and started to work on that topics mainly. And let's say a few years afterward, I came the first time into contact with Jeff Brown. You probably know he's a really nice guy. I was really at the beginning also regarding my driving simulation experience, and he provided to me a lot of advices, a lot of information as well, sometimes some data when he could. And yeah, actually, incidentally, a few years afterward, I started working on an LMP2 model with the latest patch, let's say. And he started working on an LMP2 cars for CORE Autosports, and the team was completely new to the car and to the championship. So he was looking for somebody more or less doing volunteering simulation work. And for me, working with Jeff was already exciting without even having to know what I had to do for him. And so we started discussing this, and then we started doing simulation our way, of course, because we didn't have the tools or the resources that big teams have. But it worked out pretty well. The team was very successful. Of course, with a guy like Jeff, you are successful even if you do calculation on a piece of paper, not even talking about simulation. But it was really a nice experience. I think for me, it was really a huge learning experience. And I hope that it also worked good for the team, because at the end, the team nearly won the championship at their first year in the LMP2 class. And at that time in the IMSA championship, actually the LMP2 class was together with the DPI cars. So they were balanced together. So we, as a team, we were fighting against manufacturers actually with a special LMP2 car, which was pretty exciting. As I said, Jeff did a lot of magic on the strategy side. The drivers did a good job. It's not about simulation only, at least, but it was fun to contribute a tiny little bit, at least. It was really...
So tell me that you started from zero with a model. Where did you start? So say someone's listening now and they go, actually, I'm pretty good at Excel or something. Can I have a go at doing something like that? What would you suggest to them?
It's, let's say, there are two phases to vehicle modeling for driving simulation, at least as long as you use what I would call a commercial software, what other people would call a video game. Because at the end, what we used was a very customized model, but at the end put into a video game, a driving simulator, a pretty old one actually, because we use a factor for that project. And basically, the first part is probably the most boring one, let me say, which you really need to work out during many hours testing or looking for information, which is really learning the language of the code behind the simulator. So you have to understand, okay, if I want to model, let me say, this downforce or this center of gravity position or whatever, what should I write into this file or that file? This is something luckily I had done already when I met Jeff for this project. So the next part is really collecting as many information as you can about the car. And of course, normally, if you are at least at a certain level in motorsport, the manual of the car is the first source of information. If the company is serious about that, they provide not all what you need, but a lot of information that you can use, and with a tiny bit of help from outside, then you can put all together and already build up a decent model, let me say. And then you need anyway, beside what the manufacturer can give you, always the black magic related to tire modeling. It's again something that at a certain level you get help about. Normally, for example, at 2 level, but also in some lower class, you get at least some information from some data from the manufacturer. But yeah, that's really the beginning. Tires are complicated. Very good.
So that's a kind of a good question, really, because what is it that people are trying to do with a simulation model? Because the tires are a problem, but they're only a problem if you're trying to do something maybe advanced or something. I think you can still work to predict something earlier. I don't know. What was your aim when you started with simulation?
Let's say we have to do a distinction, I think. I heard your interesting podcast with Aris Vasilagos from Assetto Corsa. Let's say what they do is probably, for a certain point of view, even more complicated than what I did, because you have to keep a lot of different people happy, and that's all about driving feeling. What I did with Jeff is really, driving feeling is a consequence, but it's not the main driver. You try to build up with a very simple software if you want. Actually, a software like a Factor or Assetto Corsa is super complicated, but it's anyway something that everybody can afford, more or less. We're talking about a software that costs maybe 50 euros or whatever. So it's not the typical price that you would encounter in the motorsport industry. But still, you want to try to create a model that is as similar as possible to the real car, at least in terms of behavior. And here I'm talking not only at least driving behavior, but also about how the subsystems behave. So, for example, let me say you want to have the aerodynamic side of the car as similar as possible to the real one. You want to have the suspension behaving as similar as possible to the real car. And that requires, first of all, a huge amount of data, but sometimes it's really also about getting a feeling about certain areas that are difficult to measure or to get data about. And at a certain point, you have to accept that there is an uncertainty anyway. So basically, you try to get the best fit possible, the best correlation possible, but you're always careful and you always look to trends more than the absolute data match, let me say, which is anyway something very, very volatile, I would say. Today you would have a perfect match between simulation and reality, and tomorrow the weather or the track is different and you're starting from the beginning again. But it's an interesting work, let me say.
Yeah, your point there about it changing, it all goes out the window. I suppose it's useful to be clear on your objective. So if you're trying to replicate the car in its entirety on a particular track such that the driver feels it's no different, and you can change all the same settings that you can on the real car, and it will have exactly the same effect that it would do on the real car. If that's the ultimate goal, coming all the way back, there's still other things you can do, I think, at a much more simplistic level that allow you to effectively get the car like 80% of the way there. So you've got the right gearing, you've got the right aero balance, or whatever in your case. You can do these things at a much more simplistic level, and then you go on to how does it feel, and what does a lap time do, and if I make that change, what can I expect in terms of the handling? Is that a process that you went through, or did you just go straight for the full vehicle lap time simulator?
It was, let me say 50-50. What I'll try to explain. For sure, when you start working on the simulation side, at the beginning, let's say 50%, let me say, it's not really that balanced, but anyway, 50% of the time you just try to validate the model, and still in a phase where you're not totally sure that your model is perfectly validated, you try anyway to find some answers to at least basic questions that are sometimes even more important than the detailed question anyway. Just to make an example, at the beginning of the year, we were still adjusting some details of the model, mainly related to areas where the manufacturer was not providing the exact information about the exact parts that the team was using, for example, because in IMSA you also had a bit more freedom in terms of components than, for example, in the World Endurance Championship, in the LMP2 class at least. And there were anyway some areas that were important in terms of handling. And of course, you always have to be careful when you evaluate the handling of a car with a model that is not good or is not perfect, because you can very quickly get a wrong feeling about that. But at the same time, it's also normally, these areas are also normally the ones that take more time to be changed on the track. So what we did at the beginning, for example, was, just to name one, a lot of works on the differential, because the differential is really complicated to be adjusted on the track side. And Jeff wanted to understand, okay, the manufacturer suggests to use this setting, but what about this one, and this one? So we started doing session in the simulator. And at the end, this session, if you look to the correlation between the log data of the real car and the log data we had in the simulation, it was not that good actually, but still we could narrow the window that Jeff could use on the track. So he already knew when he came to a certain track, okay, I will not try this setting because we have seen that it's really bad, but maybe these other two, they both provided good feeling on the simulation side, so maybe we have to take the time to try both of them. But maybe it's just 2, not 5.
And I think that's a really good point that a lot of people miss when they're thinking about simulation, as it's got to be super realistic and it's got to, represent my lap time to within several hundred of representations. It's almost taking a step back and thinking, how can I use these tools to reduce the uncertainty, to make my life easier? Like you say, so things that are difficult to change at the track, what is it? Can I narrow down the options that I've got such that I'm making my life easier, or it's going to be good enough? Or flipping the other way, make sure I don't put on something that's really wrong. So that could be a diff, or it could be gearing, or whatever. And then so you're using the simulation to help you reduce that uncertainty to a point. If you've got 10 options, you can narrow it down to 2 or 3, like you're saying. You're still not sure which of those 2 or 3 are the right ones to use, but at least you're not going to be distracted and constantly worrying, I wonder if, because you've already checked all the others and okay, we're happy that the model's good enough to tell us that these ones are rubbish.
Yeah.
And then we just have to blend it with practical testing about whether these ones are actually any good or not.
Yeah, that's an important point. And actually, if you think about it in a, let me say, more graphical way, if you draw, let's say, a curve that describe how effective is a certain change in terms of lap time or whatever performance metrics you would use, it's not a linear it's not a linear curve. So, for example, if you talk about 8 possible setup change in a certain area, for example, the differential, it's not like this, that if you isolate, let me say, the last 2 or 3, the differences between these 2 or 3 setup choices is as big as you would have between one of these 3 and the first one you were trying. So let me say, if you are narrowing down to these 2 or 3 options, normally the difference between these 2 or 3 options is much smaller than if you get it completely wrong. So even if you're not at the very optimal point of this curve, still you are in a window where the sensitivity is much lower, and your performance loss, if you do a wrong choice, would be much smaller than if you were at the very beginning, let me say.
It's a lovely word that professionals in motorsports use all the time, windows. They use this the window. Are the tyres in the right window? Have we got the setup in the right window? And basically what that means is that you're in a place that is good. It's good, or it's not awful.
Yeah, exactly.
Or it's competitive, or it should be competitive, or there's some other. But within some variability, you're in the right window of this is the best performance is within these settings.
Yeah, exactly. And this is particularly important in endurance racing, actually, because first of all, normally you have different drivers driving the car. This is a critical point. Of course, getting the right window in terms of tire performance, aerodynamic, and so on is very important. But if one of the 2 or 3 drivers driving the car is completely unable to use the full performance, or anyway something close to the full performance of the car, you lost already. In a long race where 2, 3, or even 4 drivers drive the same car. That's a very important point. And then, of course, in pure terms of engineering, you want a car that performs as good as possible, but you also want a car that is not too sensible to changing conditions, and that's another way to say that your window must be as big as possible, let me say, because you want to avoid that if a disturbance comes from outside and you didn't see that coming, you are not completely lost. At least you lose something for sure, but you are not losing seconds and seconds.
So what's lovely is that it's the same problem that anyone taking their car out on track has. Whether you're on your own or you're in a small team or whatever, or you're a professional team, everyone's got the same problem that you're trying to solve. It's just what's nice about the professional approach and the resources or people like yourself working for the love of it is the opportunity to maybe get a little bit more specific about, have more confidence in what will work. I think it's a better way of putting it. You've got more confidence to say these settings should be good, or this approach should be good, because you can use it for driving as well. You could say, how should I drive this lap? And you could say, this approach should be more effective.
Yeah, and this is a critical part, and another part is always something, or let's say it's not always something that people underestimate, but it's something very important, let me say, at the higher level in motorsport. And I'm not saying that I'm an expert about that, but it's something I'm learning about as well, let me say. But that sometimes, in my experience, also according to my previous experience at least, is something that a lower level in motorsport, or anyway, level where the structure of a team, for example, is not strong enough to or don't have the resources to do certain studies, what you're also trying to understand is, okay, what can I do if the situation that I have in front of me change completely? So let me say, you go to the track with your car, very stupid example, but I think it fits. And your car was perfect with a certain set of tire. And then you don't find that tire anymore. You have to buy different tires. And the guy is driving awfully. So what is going on? What is going wrong with my car? And if you have tried upfront, let me say, what kind of effect certain changes have generically, not talking about finding the best setup here, but really just to understand in which direction you can go and how effective it would be if the car shows a certain kind of reaction when you drive. Then at least you are better prepared. You're not in a panic situation, and you can react more rationally, let me say, ideally basing on data. Unfortunately, data is not always available, but that would be the best solution in my opinion, because at least you're not just betting, it's really engineering.
So what impact do the drivers have on your simulation? Because you're doing driver in the loop, DIL, driver in the loop simulation, is that right? So you want the driver to give you some feedback, I imagine.
Yeah, I actually do two kind of simulation. The first one is indeed driver in the loop, and I'll come to that because this is a funny story regarding the work I did for Jeff. And the other part is lap time simulation. So basically you have a solver that is computing more or less the best performance possible over a lap of a certain car, better said, of a certain vehicle model. And they both have a place. Also, in my opinion, at amateur level, they could both have a place. But for sure, if I had to choose one, if I were a weekend driver, I would go to the driver in the loop side, because first of all, because it's more fun, and second, because I think up to a certain point, also with respect to the skills of the driver and the experience, it's more about what you feel comfortable with than what really makes the car performing better. Because this is always a topic, let me say. If you use a kind of synthetic kind of simulation, like for example lap time simulation, you can isolate the effects of certain parameters much better because you don't have the driver. The computer is always driving the car at its best. But on the other hand, it's always you always have to be careful not to make a car that is too good for the computer, but it's awful for the real driver. And that's where the driver in the loop simulation, even a basic one, something that everybody probably could build up at home, could help. And this is the funny part, actually, because as we discussed that I'm in Germany and Jeff, of course, is in the US. And it was a bit complicated to get the driver to come to me and drive my simulator. So I was the driver for the simulation, actually. And at the beginning, it was really about, okay, what should I do to drive this car, at least in a similar manner to what professional drivers like Colin, his son, was driving the car, for example, are doing. So you can see that was even another variable into the equation, because of course I'm not even close to what a professional driver can do. But yeah, as I said, it was more about understanding what happens than just replicate exactly what a real driver does, or let me say perform as good as a real driver.
Can you give us an example of something you did, like a setup for a weekend or something? Can you give us an example of how that went or what you did?
Yeah, of course. The most, let's say, the most funny event, let me say, was actually a test, but that's probably not the most engineering interesting event. Anyway, that's a funny story. The team was going to test in Watkins Glen, and they had previous data related to other cars about the track. So Jeff sent me a basic setup, and we started testing in the simulator. We went through several options, and then they went to the test, went through other options, and then we did it again in the simulator and again for the race. Anyway, before they went for the test, we got a certain lap time in the simulator. You can find actually a video about that in the internet. I have a video in my YouTube channel about that. Jeff was surprised that the car could be so fast in Watkins Glen, and to be honest, I didn't know. I have no experience on I had no experience in Watkins Glen, and at the end, it could well be that the model was completely off. Already, the kind of tarmac that you have in a certain track can influence dramatically the lap times. And Jeff was expecting a certain lap time. The simulation showed more or less 2 seconds faster. And the funny part was that then they went at the test, and with their best setup and new tires, they actually performed, I think, 1 or 2 tenths faster than what we had in the simulation. But it was really close, actually. That was a nice example of how sometimes simulation can bring surprise on, let me say. And another one was, but that came at the end of the year after we really did a lot of work in terms of correlation and refining the model. And I also got more used to going to replicate what the drivers do on the track. They went to Laguna Seca for, I don't know, it was maybe the third last race or something like that. And it was funny because we developed a setup in the simulation, and that was basically or mainly driven by Jeff's experience. He really knows what he does, and he knew that for Laguna Seca certain things could work. And it was funny because we tried them in the simulator, and every time we went faster and faster. Every move that he suggested was actually working. And they arrived at the track with a certain setup, and I think all what they did was changing the rear springs about 50 pounds per inch. I don't know. They basically changed nearly anything. And I don't know if they did the pole position that time, but for sure they came second. And okay, they were very fast, but Jeff, of course, did one of his magic with the strategy. He let the car wait on the pit lane for 30 seconds, because after that 40 seconds, he would change driver, and there was a yellow flag. It was really a magic. I cannot repeat it anyway. But they came second again against the work manufacturer teams with a setup basically developed inner factor. So just to say that sometimes it works. It doesn't work always, but sometimes it works.
Yeah, wow, that's amazing. What do you think people could do if they didn't have like R Factor, or if they didn't have access, or they've never done anything like this before? What would you suggest that if they think, actually, I'd like to try and do something with that for my car, how do I do that? Because possibly they might have a simulator, they ever went locked down and everything. A lot of people have got simulators now, or at least PlayStations and things like this, but maybe they have a PC set up with iRacing or off. What would you suggest they try? Because maybe they're not so confident to change the setup.
You mean anyway on the simulator, or just, let me say, to prepare for an event?
To prepare for an event. So say they've got an event coming up and they want to try to take advantage of some of this process and some of this technology that professionals are using. What do you suggest that they do maybe to start?
You talked about Excel at the beginning, and I think Excel is actually probably one of the best tools that you can find in every computer, more or less, nowadays. There are really basic calculations that you could do in Excel about your car, at least to understand the magnitude of an effect that a certain change could have on, not necessarily on the final behavior, but anyway on certain areas of the car. I don't know. For example, it's pretty easy to calculate the roll stiffness of the car, or the roll stiffness distribution between front and rear if you have enough data. And normally the information required for such a calculation can be either measured or calculated. There are a lot of information on the internet. You don't need to be an engineer to get this data correctly, and try to understand, okay, for example, if I have understeer, just to name one, and I want to correct it, what would have a bigger effect? Changing the springs, changing the anti-roll bar or the anti-roll bar seating, or changing the tire pressure, just to name one. And sometimes already with this kind of approach, you can get surprises with certain cars, in my experience. And this is something that takes a bit of time, but it's very cheap because normally you have already Excel in your computer, for example. And what is very interesting for me, at least, that was always the motivation factor. I know I'm a bit nerd, maybe. Not all the drivers are like this, and luckily they are not. But if you are into, let me say, engineering or technology, the nice part is that during the process you learn a lot, because you have to find yourself the information, you have to put them together, and that's already a huge and very interesting learning experience, because you get your car much better, and at the end you are always better prepared, even if you cannot develop the setup, let me say, the final setup for your qualification session up front, but still you can at least understand better what is going on. For me, that would be the very first thing. Again, something easy to do, but still lots to learn.
I think that's a great point, because often you can find yourself in a situation at the track where, like you say, something has changed, like the weather or the car's not to your liking as a driver. And then the question is, what will make a difference, and by how much? Yeah. And is it the driver or is it the car? And what is the best way through that puzzle of getting to a point where there's some frustration or some confusion to a point where there's confidence and clarity? And the only reason we're not quick is because the driver screwed up the last corner, but if they got the right corner, it would have been okay. You know what I mean? It's like, it's not a question. There's no question about why the lap time wasn't what we wanted. There's no haziness or I wonder if. So it's trying to transition from the vague, because possibly what can happen in those situations is there's a lot of ideas that get put forward that have basis, and some of them have basis, and others are not, don't necessarily stand up to scrutiny. So I think what you're suggesting is if you can basically work out some of this nerdy stuff a little bit earlier on and give yourself an idea of, it should be this. It may not be that, but this is probably the thing that's going to help you in that situation. Is that kind of what you're...
Yes, absolutely. There are, in my opinion, two side points to this. The first one is to take notes. Every time you do a change, of course, you should note what you did. That's the very first thing. But also, for example, if you had a tool like what we're talking about now, a very basic tool, picturing whatever basics of your car, I would for sure note down also, okay, I changed my rear springs by that amount. What does this number in my tool show for a change? So for example, I don't know, you had, I say a number, 50% roll stiffness distribution on the front, now you have 51. Okay. And then you drive the car and you can judge yourself, okay, this 1% produced subjectively a certain change in the behavior. And down also your feeling, your reactions to that. And then the next time...
Which can be... I can't tell the difference, by the way. I think that's a valid feedback.
Yeah, it could be that the sensitivity, that your sensitivity or the sensitivity of whatever other component in the car, let me say, it's not that fine, let me say. It's not that, subtle. I don't know how to say the right word in English. But anyway, it could well be that a certain change doesn't produce any sensible effect for you. But that's also a learning experience. At least next time, okay, 1%, let's say 1% change is too less for me. I would not feel any different. I need 5%, let me say. Or maybe, I don't know, the spring doesn't produce the effect I would need. I need to change the anti-roll bar or whatever other part of the car. And taking notes, also if you don't do proper simulation, you can still at least learn from your mistakes and understand what the consequences are also in mathematical terms for a certain change. And another thing that, in my opinion, can be extremely important at the level is that what I know, at least from my previous experience, is that at the track there are always what I would call magicians. So people that always know better than you what is happening and always have the best solution. But if you try to ask, okay, but what's the explanation for that? Then they start to discuss about, very funny topics, actually, or they produce very funny explanations. And with such basic tools, actually, you can cut their legs at the end. You can work your way through the fog without having to rely on any exoteric explanation. It's something very easy, but can bring you very far way forward, actually, in my opinion.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point, in the sense that it's important to have the confidence yourself in why you're doing why you're running whatever you're running on your car. And even if that doesn't mean going to school and doing an engineering degree. It's literally, that can be trial and error, but structured. So you just say, this is the setting, I'm going to run around and I have an opinion on it, whatever that is. And then I'll change the setting, and then I've got a new opinion. But then the sort of caveat to that is that your opinion will evolve as well as you get better. So one of the things that, can be worth doing is going back. So if you try some settings and then you go back to the original setting and then see again, but do you still have the same opinion as you had the first time you ran that?
Yeah, back-to-back comparison. Absolutely. That's a very interesting point. You are right. I absolutely agree, because sometimes subjective feelings can change even during the same day. Maybe you're still sleeping in the morning, or you're very tired in the afternoon, and your perception of a certain situation is different. Absolutely. Yeah, I totally agree.
As amateurs, we take a little bit longer to warm up than the professionals. So as drivers and mechanics or whatever it is. And so hopefully by later in the day, your head's into it more than the first session. So I don't know.
You get more confidence. That's also something that you get when you're trying or when you are training in a driving simulator. Normally, up to a certain point, the more you drive, the better you are, the faster you become. Practice makes you perfect. There is no such a thing like too much driving.
Yeah, it's funny you say that. I think there's slightly curveball, but my experience, I've got some experience in the world of sport outside of motorsport. And one of the things that some of the coaches I've worked with there say, it's about having deliberate practice. So you can practice your sport and your skill, but if you're practicing the wrong thing, that's worse than not doing anything at all. And so having a sort of a structured plan of what is it that we're actually going to do, and back to motor racing, do we just pound around the track and just work it out and trip over a good lap time 1 in 10 times and keep it out the barrier? Or what is it that we're actually trying to do, and can we add some deliberate practice to our driving and even to our testing? And one of the problems I struggle with when we start talking about this stuff is because we're engineers or whatever, it just makes it sound so dull. And it's not dull, because we all want to have fun and want to have more success. So it's just the process to go through. This is a method that works, in the sense that you can, if you follow this practice, then you're going to be quicker and have more fun and more success. So
exactly, that's what I would say as well. Of course, you don't have to become a scientist when driving your car, but I think every driver putting your car in a racetrack wants to be faster, to achieve better lap times. That's surely part of the fun, right? If you have a better method to get there, still having fun, but having fun the right way, let me say, why not? I have to say, the time I spent in motorsport, it means until more or less 10 years ago now, it was not that common to find drivers who had a coach. And I can admit, as an engineer, as a race engineer, I would probably be very critical about that, about a driver bringing somebody else who had to tell him, do that. First of all, because it's part of your job as an engineer sometimes, but also because you always think, why? At the end, you are the driver. But the more I spend time, let me say, on the side of motorsport, as I said, like an hobby, and the more I understood actually the role that a coach can have. And that's a very important point that you mentioned, because I really think that sometimes having somebody that is somehow a bit more distant from the problem than you are when you are in the car and see things that you probably don't see can really make a huge difference. And that's something that can for sure be trained in simulation, but also on the simulation side, you have to train the right things. Otherwise, you learn the wrong things anyway.
Yeah, exactly. We like you made the point already. We don't want the fastest car on the laptop. We want the fastest car on the track, and the track's going to be the driver and the car. If the drivers need some, and I was going to do it again then. I was going to go off and say, if the driver needs some support mentally, it's like it's remedial, and it's not. It's a benefit. One of my guests, who is a mental performance coach, came on the show, and he goes, there was someone from an American football team. Something. If your athletes aren't getting mental performance, then you're crazy. Yeah. And it was Joe Madden, I think. And I thought that was a really nice quote because it flips it round. Like, if you're not getting someone to help you through the mental side of it and your internal dialogue and how you can get the most out of yourself as an athlete, then you're mad.
Yeah, but I can tell you, good engineers really get that. I think that's something that Jeff, just to mention him again, would calling engineering the driver. And it's not only about coaching, it's really also about the relationship between the engineer, or anyway, the technological side of the team, with the driver, being the driver either a professional or a non-professional driver. At the end, as you said, you want a package that works at the best with the conditions that you find. The driver is probably, from an engineering perspective, one of the most influential conditions that you have to take into account. And as a driver, on the other hand, I would say that, of course, having somebody somehow helping you on the performance and mental side of the thing, for me, it would be a huge help. And if to that you can add also a bit of technical preparation, that would also bring even more your confidence that, okay, now I have a problem. Let me say, I'm driving my car, I'm completely out of the window, as somebody would say, and I have no clue what is happening. Okay, calm down, breathe. Let's look at the notes that I have. Let's look at the numbers that comes out from my Excel spreadsheet, and let's talk to my coach. And you already have, several parts that you can put together to come again in a more calm way, let me say, into the window. It's all, at the end, it's all about having confidence in what you do. And that's an interesting part also for simulation in my experience, because you said something correct. At the end, you don't want the car to be fast in the laptop, but you want the car to be fast on the racetrack. And it's interesting because if you use the simulation properly, sometimes you don't produce the fastest car on the laptop on purpose, because certain windows, I know this word come again and again and again into play, but anyway, that you should not go out of a certain window for certain parameters. And even if you know exactly that the simulation would show it faster, also that for your driver that car would not be good at all. So you know upfront that you cannot go over certain edges, otherwise anyway you're producing actually a worse result, even if the computer tells you differently. It's a very interesting topic actually. One can learn a lot from that, yeah.
Yeah, it is absolutely fascinating. I personally, I think it's really nice because you do have this tension between the optimizing of the mechanical piece and then the how the driver feels about that, but it's the two together, and that's a really important point. And I do think it is becoming increasingly more prevalent that people have coaching, whether they're visible or not. It certainly does make a difference. Everyone's had some kind of person to talk to. I think it's maybe dad and son, or whatever. And one of the things that we talked about in the world of professional sports is that the coach and a race engineer are basically the same jobs. If you had the Venn diagram in sport, the coaches are very good on the human side and traditionally not so good on the mathematics and the calculation and the objective data side. So they had that bit to learn. And then traditionally in motor racing, you could say it's the opposite. So they're quite comfortable with the numbers of roll stiffness distribution and aero balance, blah blah blah, but they're not so good at the driver, the human side. So they are the same role. It's just how much they overlap. It's a very fascinating subject. So there you go. So we set off talking about simulation, and now we're talking about the human. We can't go away from it. It's brilliant, It's brilliant.
Yeah, but that's the fascinating part. If it was about robots, it would probably be much more boring. The human part is always the more fascinating, in my opinion.
So where next for you then? So you have a blog. What's your blog?
Yeah, it's I don't know how to pronounce it correctly. Anyway, it's drracing.wordpress.com.
And what have you got on there?
I started blogging actually a lot of time ago, and it was at the beginning really just a way to share experiences, and to every time you write down something, and we are again at taking notes with this regard, you understand it better, or you have to be sure that you understood it correctly. And that was probably, together with the pleasure of writing, one of the first motivation for me to start my blog. And it went through different phases. At the beginning, it was more about what I was doing as I was still working in motorsport, and a little moved more into really vehicle dynamics topics. Again, different phases regarding more driving in the loop simulation. Now it's probably more about lap time simulation because it's what I do the most recently. And I try to share not my knowledge, because I don't think any special knowledge that anybody else could not find in a book, or at least on the theoretical side. I try to share my experiences or the results of my experiments, let me say. I'd probably blogged at a normal driver, let me say, would find very boring because it's really nerdy again. But for me, it is not about getting more people that read what I write. It's more about, again, the pleasure of writing about what I'm doing. And if I find something interesting, I like to share it, because anyway, I don't do that for living. That's a very nice point. Sometimes you can share whatever you want, because you're not discovering most of the times at least, you're not discovering any secret that would jeopardize your working activity. Of course, I try to cover the data when the data come from a team or there is a non-disclosure agreement behind. But I can openly share my thoughts, because at the end, I'm not working for anybody with this regard. So it's a nice activity. I like it very much.
I'll put a link in the show notes. Make sure people get. I've actually read quite a lot of it, but I'm quite nerdy myself, and I really enjoy the way in which you're talking your way through it. It's literally like we're listening to you talk it through, and it is technical. But I think what's nice is that it shows that one person on their own can do with some determination and some tools. You're using the tools that are commonly available, and it just almost shows you a way that people can dip into this stuff if they really want to do it. Go and check it out. I think it's great, and you must keep on doing it.
For sure. I will try at least. Time is always the bottleneck, but as I said, I enjoy it very much, so I will try.
Wonderful. Look, thank you so much for taking the time today. It's been an absolutely fascinating conversation. I knew it would be. There's so many subjects we haven't even delved into, and maybe we can have you back on another time to touch into some of those. But look, thank you again. It's been great.
Thank you very much for having me. It was really funny, and as you said, it's also funny to see how actually we moved completely out compared to what we wanted to discuss at the beginning. But that's probably the most funny part actually. So thank you very much. It was really a nice time. Bye bye.
One of the things I've noticed over the years talking to the really very best engineers is how humble they really are when they're talking about their own achievements. Andrea definitely fits that mould. I hope you're able to get lots of tips and tricks and maybe a little bit more confidence around the subject of simulation and thinking about how you start to use these kind of tools to improve our own racing, reducing our uncertainty and making life a little bit easier. You may know that at the end of season 1, I wrote the Motorsports Playbook, a summary distilling the first 20 shows into nuggets of wisdom. I made the notes so that you don't have to. If you've not got it yet, go and grab yourself a copy from the website. If you like this episode, be sure to subscribe to the podcast and visit us at yourdatadriven.com.